Okay, just continuing on with this business of offering up spiritual sacrifices. What I was saying at the end of the last tape or video about precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. That's the verse that I was actually thinking of, reading it out of the King James. It's actually in Psalm 116 and verse 15, and Psalm 116 and verse 17, another scripture that says, I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. Sometimes it's a bit tough to thank God for things, when we're going through hard times, but he still wants us to be thankful even when we're going through hard times. Okay, so precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Sacrifice requires a death, doesn't it? The animal was killed, offered up on the altar. We, as we'll read a bit later, soon when we get to it, in the book of Romans, chapter 12 and verse 1 tells us that we have to offer up our bodies as a living sacrifice. And so we have to die. And precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. So let's read a couple of scriptures over in the New Testament now that talk about these spiritual sacrifices that we have to offer up. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18 we'll read. It says this. But I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odour of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God. So he's saying, this is Pablo saying, I've received a gift from you, Philippians, and it's a sacrifice. You've made a sacrifice to give me this gift. Where we make sacrifices to give one another money when we see each other needing money, and whatever else. Help each other out when we see each other needing a hand. So we make these sacrifices, and God is well pleased with these sacrifices. So let's have a look over in the book of Hebrews now, chapter 13 and verse 16. He says, but to do good and to communicate, do not forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. Do good. Okay, sometimes it's a sacrifice to do good. Sometimes you don't want to, you just feel like you'd rather stay at home and put your feet up and have a rest rather than go to a worship service. And we have to make the sacrifice to do that sometimes. The old man dying, the death of our old selves. We have to become living sacrifices. Do good. Well, that's just one example of what doing good is. Doing good, walking righteously, loving God, doing the right thing when it's going to cost us something. That's doing good. And that's sacrifice. God says these sacrifices, I'm well pleased with these sacrifices. They are spiritual sacrifices that we have to offer up. And he goes on to say, and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifice. Communication, that can be a sacrifice sometimes. Again, we might not feel like communicating with God. And just recently we said that the number one commandment that Jesus said is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. And to love a person means to have a relationship with them, and having a relationship with somebody means you have to communicate with them. And here he says, don't forget to communicate. So with God, we need to communicate with him. We need to take time to talk to him, and we need to take time to listen for his voice. I was staying in the Philippines one time in the room of some body who was gracious enough to allow me to stay in their room for a while, and up on the wall they had a poster, and it said on this poster, God speaks to them who take the time to listen. Sometimes it takes time to listen to God. I mean, there are times when God will speak to us when we're not really listening, and he will speak to us, and we'll say, well, we didn't really expect to hear that, but God's spoken to us. But there are other times when we really have to listen for God's voice and be attentive and spend time in God's presence and asking. And communication. But that's with God, but we also have to communicate with one another, because Jesus said that the second most important commandment is that we love our neighbours as ourselves. We love one another, love the brethren, and do good to all men, but particularly to them of the household of faith. That's something that Pablo said. So sometimes Jesus said we have to love our enemies. Man, that can be a sacrifice, can't it? We don't feel like loving our enemies sometimes, especially when they do and say nasty things to us. That's a bit tough. But hey, ask God for the grace to do that and walk in righteousness and communicate. Don't forget to communicate. Okay. One last scripture I'm just going to read, point you to book of Romans chapter 12, and it says there, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Okay, that's the King James Bible. Some other more modern translations don't say reasonable service. They say it is your reasonable worship. So worship and service. You know, back in the people of the Old Testament, Israel, the Jewish people and the Israelites, they used to consider that everything they did was worship to God. So everything that we should be like that as well. We should be thinking that everything we do is worship to God. And that's why the scripture says, whatever you do, do it heartily and do it as unto the Lord. So things that we do them as unto God. And we are a living sacrifice. We are alive, but we need to be constantly making these sacrifices, constantly doing things that are not benefit to us sometimes, but benefit to others and benefit to God, of course. So don't forget, folks, offer up spiritual sacrifices. With spiritual sacrifices, God is well pleased. Okay, so that's what we're called to do as Christians, offer up these spiritual sacrifices. So God bless.